episode 91, titled Credential Attacks, Reuse, Brute Force, and Layered Defenses, we treat credential abuse as the simplest path to broad access because it often avoids sophisticated exploitation entirely. Attackers do not need to break a system when they can log in, and the exam frequently frames this as a risk management problem where basic controls outperform clever tricks. Credential attacks scale well because automation can test thousands of attempts quickly, and because human behavior creates predictable weaknesses like password reuse and weak recovery patterns. The defensive goal is not to eliminate every login attempt, because legitimate users will always make mistakes, but to make unauthorized access unlikely and obvious when it is attempted. When you build layered defenses around authentication, you reduce both the probability of compromise and the blast radius if a compromise occurs. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Reuse attacks are powered by breached password datasets, where attackers take credentials stolen from one service and try them across many other services, hoping that users reuse the same password. The attacker's advantage is that reuse is common, and even a small success rate produces real access when the volume of attempts is high. This attack is also efficient because the attacker is not guessing randomly. They are testing known combinations of usernames and passwords that have worked before somewhere else. Reuse is especially dangerous in environments where usernames are predictable, like email address-based logins, because that removes one more barrier. The exam angle is that reuse turns external breaches into internal risk, so defenses must assume that some portion of your user's passwords are already known to attackers. When you accept that reality, you prioritize controls that make a stolen password insufficient. Brute force and spraying are related but distinct patterns, and recognizing the difference helps you select the right detection and response behaviors. Brute force focuses on a small number of accounts and tries many passwords against them, which often generates high failure volume on a single target identity. Password spraying flips the pattern, trying a small set of common passwords across many accounts, which reduces per-account failures and is designed to avoid lockouts and noisy alerts. Spraying is especially common against remote access portals and cloud identity endpoints because the attacker can test large populations quickly with a low failure footprint per user. Both techniques rely on predictable password choices and weak rate controls, and both can be amplified through distributed sources to evade simplistic blocking. The exam tends to reward the idea that patterns matter, because the same number of failures can mean different things depending on whether they are concentrated or spread out. Multi-factor authentication, often shortened to MFA after first mention, and strong lockout policies are core controls because they change the economics of credential attacks by making password possession insufficient and by limiting repeated guessing. Multi-factor authentication adds an additional proof, ideally one that is resistant to interception and replay, so that a stolen password alone cannot complete authentication. Lockout policies and rate limiting reduce the feasibility of brute force by forcing delays, requiring additional verification, or temporarily blocking repeated failures, which raises attacker cost and increases detection opportunities. These controls must be balanced to avoid creating denial conditions for legitimate users, but the exam expects you to recognize that the balance is achieved through thoughtful thresholds and recovery processes, not by turning protection off. When multi-factor authentication and lockouts are implemented well, credential attacks become far less effective and far more visible. The goal is to create friction for attackers while keeping the legitimate user experience predictable. Conditional access adds a powerful layer because it uses context to decide whether a login should be allowed, challenged, or blocked, and context is exactly what attackers struggle to mimic consistently. Location signals can identify impossible travel or logins from regions that do not match user behavior, and those signals can trigger additional verification or denial. Device posture signals can ensure that a login comes from a managed, healthy device rather than an unknown endpoint, which is especially valuable for remote access and administrative roles. Risk signals can incorporate known compromised credential indicators, unusual authentication patterns, and threat intelligence, which helps prioritize enforcement when the probability of attack is higher. The exam framing often emphasizes that conditional access reduces risk without relying solely on password complexity because it makes authentication adaptive rather than static. When conditional access is applied to high-risk pathways, you shrink the attacker's window of opportunity even when credentials are valid. Password hygiene still matters, but it should be explained in practical terms that align to how people actually behave and how modern authentication systems operate. Length and uniqueness are more important than complex composition rules because longer, unique passwords resist guessing and make reuse less damaging across services. Uniqueness breaks the reuse attack chain because a password that is only used in one place cannot be leveraged elsewhere even if it is breached. Rotation has to be practical because forced frequent changes often lead to predictable patterns and increased support load, which can weaken security rather than strengthen it. The exam tends to reward the idea that password policy should reduce real-world risk, not merely satisfy a traditional rule set, so focusing on length, uniqueness, and strong multi-factor authentication is usually the defensible stance. When password hygiene is treated as part of a layered model rather than as the only line of defense, it supports security without becoming a usability trap. Now consider a scenario where an attacker targets a virtual private network portal, spelled out as virtual private network, using password spraying to gain initial access. The attacker may begin with a list of known usernames, often harvested from public sources or previous breaches, and then try a few common passwords across many accounts to avoid triggering lockouts. The first symptom might be a broad increase in failed logins with low failures per user, often distributed over time and across source addresses, which can look like normal user mistakes if you do not watch patterns carefully. If the attacker finds one weak account, they can establish remote access, and then the focus shifts from authentication to authorization, because the privileges granted after login determine blast radius. Strong multi-factor authentication would block the login even if the password is correct, and conditional access might block the attempt based on risk signals or untrusted device posture. This scenario shows why remote access is a high-risk entry point and why defenses must be layered at the identity plane, not only at the network edge. A common pitfall is disabling lockouts because of support tickets, because that decision often trades short-term convenience for long-term exposure. Support load can rise when lockouts are too aggressive or when user education is weak, but the correct response is tuning and process improvement, not removing the control entirely. Attackers specifically design spraying patterns to avoid lockouts, so eliminating lockouts makes the attacker's job easier and increases the probability of eventual success. A better approach is to adjust thresholds, apply progressive delays, and use risk-based challenges that reduce false positives while still limiting repeated attempts. The exam expects you to recognize that operational pain is real, but that security controls should be engineered to be sustainable rather than abandoned under pressure. When you keep lockout protections but tune them intelligently, you preserve security without making on-call unbearable. Another pitfall is shared administrative accounts because they hide accountability and increase risk in ways that credential attacks exploit directly. Shared accounts make it difficult to attribute actions, which undermines auditing and makes incident response slower because you cannot tell whose credentials were used. They also increase exposure because more people know the same secret, and the chance of that secret being leaked or reused somewhere else rises with every additional user. Shared accounts often end up with broad privileges because they were created to make things easy, and broad privileges turn a single compromised login into a high-impact event. The exam framing typically emphasizes individual accountability and least privilege, and shared administrator accounts violate both principles at once. When you eliminate shared accounts and enforce unique administrative identities, you reduce the blast radius of credential compromise and improve your ability to investigate and recover. Quick wins that consistently help include monitoring failed logins and enforcing least privilege because these measures improve both detection and containment with relatively low complexity. Monitoring should focus on patterns such as sudden spikes, distributed failures, repeated failures followed by success, and abnormal source distributions because those patterns indicate automated abuse rather than human error. Least privilege ensures that even if an attacker gains access, their permissions are limited to what the compromised account should legitimately do, which reduces impact and buys time. Least privilege also supports containment because you can isolate and reset a smaller set of permissions and sessions rather than assuming that every account has broad reach. The exam expects you to connect monitoring to early detection and least privilege to impact reduction because that is the practical risk story. When these quick wins are in place, credential attacks become easier to spot and harder to turn into major incidents. Service accounts deserve special operational attention because they often have stable credentials, broad access, and limited interactive protections, which makes them attractive targets. Protecting service accounts means storing secrets securely, limiting scope, using managed identities where possible, and avoiding embedding long-lived credentials in scripts or configuration files. Rotating secrets safely requires coordination because services can break if a credential changes without synchronized updates, so rotation should be planned and tested rather than improvised. Monitoring should include service account authentication patterns because unusual usage can indicate misuse, and misuse of service accounts often leads to stealthy persistence. The exam framing tends to treat service accounts as high-risk identities that require stronger governance because they are the keys that automation uses to operate infrastructure. When you protect and rotate service account credentials correctly, you close a path that attackers use to gain durable access. A memory anchor that keeps the defense model clear is detect, deny, verify, and reduce privileges, because it maps to how layered defenses break credential attacks at multiple stages. Detect means watching authentication telemetry for abnormal failure patterns and suspicious successes so you can respond before the attacker settles in. Deny means applying rate controls, lockouts, conditional access blocks, and network restrictions that prevent attempts from becoming sessions. Verify means enforcing multi-factor authentication and strong identity checks so that a password alone cannot prove legitimacy, especially on high-risk entry points like remote access. Reduce privileges means applying least privilege and removing shared admin accounts so that even a successful login produces limited damage. This anchor matches how the exam often evaluates your thinking because it shows you understand both prevention and containment in a cohesive model. When choosing defenses for high-risk remote access, the priority is to assume the entry point will be targeted and then require multiple independent signals for success. Multi-factor authentication should be enforced for remote access, ideally with strong factors and limited bypass options, because remote access is a common initial foothold. Conditional access should restrict logins based on device posture, location, and risk signals, because attackers frequently operate from unfamiliar contexts and unmanaged devices. Lockouts or progressive delays should be tuned to resist spraying while minimizing false lockouts, and monitoring should explicitly look for distributed failures across many accounts. Least privilege access after login is essential so that a compromised remote access account does not automatically grant broad internal reach, and administrative access should require additional controls beyond standard user access. When these defenses work together, remote access remains usable for legitimate users while becoming a much harder target for automated credential abuse. Episode 91 concludes with the idea that credential attacks are simple, scalable, and therefore persistent, so the best defense is a layered approach that assumes passwords will be tested and sometimes stolen. Reuse attacks exploit human habits. Brute force and spraying exploit weak rate controls, and both are sharply reduced by multi-factor authentication, tuned lockout policies, and conditional access that evaluates context. Password hygiene matters most when it emphasizes length and uniqueness, and operational discipline matters when it protects service accounts and eliminates shared administrator identities. The rehearsal assignment is a login policy practice, where you describe how your remote access entry point would enforce verification, deny abusive patterns, detect anomalies, and limit privilege after authentication. When you can narrate that policy coherently, you demonstrate exam-ready reasoning and the operational mindset needed to keep identity-based attacks from becoming widespread compromise. With that mindset, credentials stop being a single fragile gate and become one component in a defense system designed to resist abuse. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.